No. So we'll bring up this lav mic. Now it's getting a little bit louder, and you can hear me. Okay. I better sit down, or else it could take on like a revival meeting quality to it. So I'm going to sit down. But I think I think it's a good place to talk about what's happening in Cleveland. And again, I use as the backdrop the fact that you're in a unique position, because in Cleveland, in this county, and certainly as such a huge center for the entire state, you've got a platform, right? I mean, Ohio plays this role in electing who the president is. So it's very interesting to understand where things are here and where they're going. And Toby Cosgrove, let me start with you. What is the state of this community and this state in this important election year?
Well, we're seeing a very interesting thing going on here in Cleveland. I think we're seeing it reshape itself from a largely manufacturing organization to a service community. For example, the Cleveland Clinic is the second largest employer in the state with 41,000 employees, and the second largest and the largest employer Cleveland's ever had in its entire history. And it drives a lot of the economy. Essentially, if you look at the economic impact of the Cleveland Clinic alone, it's $10.5 billion. And you add on top of that University Hospital, Metro Hospital, and healthcare has gotten to be a very big sector here, driving the economy, driving employment. And then we think it's also going to, with the advent of the medical mart, we think it is going to be an economic driver for this community, bringing people here from lots and lots of areas. So we're very excited about what healthcare brings, not to mention what it's bringing in terms of innovation. We're seeing increasing amounts of new companies being spawned. We've spawned off 45 new companies out of the Cleveland Clinic. 250 relationships from the IT in terms of royalty arrangements and coming out of those. So this is an economic force, and it's a force that is a major attractor, a major employer, and a major economic force.
So Chris Connor, when President Obama comes campaigning here, he's likely to say a couple of things. Ohio's coming back. We're getting better. We did the auto bailout in Michigan and northeastern Ohio. You're really feeling the positive effects of that. The unemployment rate in this state is lower than the national average. There's a lot of pain here still, a lot of people hurting, but it's coming back. And it's because of the decisions we've made in the Obama administration. So do you credit this president and this administration for helping turn things around in Ohio and in Cleveland?
No.
But to be fair to our president, I'm most interested in making sure he's keeping the White House white and in good shape and painting it frequently.
Yes.
You know, I think you look back over the history of our great city here, David, and the momentum that we're feeling right now. So many people in this audience representing so many different sectors of our economy are on the move. This is an exciting place to be right now. And just as you made the comment about the pragmatism of that local, elected official base, and we don't look to the federal government to solve our problems or to solve these issues. We look internally first and foremost. As we run these companies, as we build these great hospitals and universities and banks that are up here on this stage, we're going to hire bodies and employees as our businesses are improving, not because the federal government's going to put some kind of a stimulus or program in there to create jobs. It's just not the way it works.
But is there nothing, Jerry Sue, to credit the administration for if this is a referendum election? And again, I'm talking, I'm putting the economic conditions of the city and the state through the prism of politics. Governor Romney is going to be telling Ohioans, look, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And based on that standard, he does have some difficulty in this state, which, by the way, his team acknowledges. So is there credit to be given?
I think there's credit to be given. As we in education, higher education in particular, but K through 12 as well, or pre-K through 12, I think we've seen an investment in education and training. obviously we're always looking for where the puck is going. So what's happening in business and industry, we are anticipating in advance because we have to educate and train those workers for the future. It's really about reclaiming the American dream. And part of reclaiming that dream is getting people back to work. So as innovation happens in Northeast Ohio, universities in Northeast Ohio, and there are over 30 of us, we have over 225,000 students, and we have to make sure that they're being educated for the jobs of the future. Because as Toby said, those jobs are changing and evolving, and we have to make sure our curriculum is changing and evolving to meet those needs.
Steve, what say on this broader topic of better off now or not?
Well, I think clearly the state's better off now than it was a few years ago. But I think that's a reflection of the commitment of the people here in Cleveland and throughout the state to stay and build. Toby runs a world-class institution, in some respects the best in the world. It could have been at MGH in Boston or any number of other cities. It's here. And there's almost a refresh of that commitment routinely expressed with different partnerships. Chris just brought jobs back from, I believe, India for a call center. How many companies are doing that? We're bringing jobs offshore back onshore. We have great medical institutions, great educational institutions. We have abundant water. We have great agriculture. And now we have low-cost, long-term, immediately available energy, combined with a skilled workforce, and that's what's driving this economic rebirth, if you will. The Rust Belt will be a thing of the past.
Mm-hmm. Talk about what you brought jobs back. Tell me the circumstances of that.
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, when you run any kind of an entity, you're looking for a talented workforce that's got the intellect, the work ethic, the drive, the connection to the cause at hand. The heart belt of America, the Midwest, has always had that in spades. And so we find great productivity here. We find great advantage to be here. Our governor, more pragmatic again, closer at home, has taken some good steps to enhance the tax structure for businesses in the United States right here in Ohio. And I think Steve's right. We're just seeing more and more people come here to set up shop, to bring jobs here for the companies that are here. One of our big regional entities that we're proud of, David, in the area is called Team Neo, which is the business attraction, and we've had a tremendous amount of interest in companies wanting to know what is it about this part of the world to come and set up operations here.
So how do, there's an interesting dynamic where the state, and again the county, has such national importance in influencing a presidential race, and yet you're all saying that a lot of the strength and innovation is not coming from federal government.
Exactly right.
So then how do you leverage this kind of opportunity in this year, in a presidential cycle, to help the city?
Bring a discussion here where they'll listen to leaders like Chris and Toby and Jerry Sue, provide concrete examples and ideas. We have a dogmatic, polar opposite approach to what's going on the Hill these days.
Yeah, I think
try and get to a consensus, at least some common points of view that will carry forward with an election platform and hopefully implementation.
I think the fundamental issue is, are they better at creating jobs than any of us in the room or on this stage? And taking more of my money to Washington to try to create jobs as opposed to leaving it here at home, we just think we'll do a better job.
David, I also say that our area has a real history of public-private partnerships. We know how to do that. We know how to make it work. And I think it's working together collaboratively, figuring out through innovation how we can move an economy forward, knowing that we have a history of high-performing people. This was a manufacturing area, industrial area. People are used to working. They're used to performing. And we're now just turning the dial so that they are performing in a different industry. But those things in our fabric, I think, make us a real model.
Toby, can you talk about this from the point of view of healthcare? I mean, one of the things that I'm asked about often is, well, what's the impact of the Supreme Court decision going to be on healthcare reform? Sure. The other thing I'm asked is, what the heck is healthcare reform? And the reality, no, but But the reality is,
That'd be a good one.
even for those of us who cover it, I have so many more questions than I do answers. I get the politics. I can explain the politics. But I'm not certain I actually understand the policy. So again, this is an opportunity where Cleveland is leading in healthcare. You tell me, what is healthcare reform?
Well, when you find out the answer to healthcare
I
reform,
should call
me,
you?
would you?
Okay, yeah.
What we started out with, I think, is a tremendous big bill that has an awful lot of things in it, much of which has not yet been defined for us. But there was a couple of things that the healthcare bill tried to do. It started out to try and increase access, and I think it did a great job at that, another 30 million people. It tried to improve quality, and we're seeing all sorts of quality metrics are now being required to be reported. And it wanted to lower costs. And I think the costs are going to go continuously up because it didn't do the things that are going to be required to reduce costs. Essentially, there's two things that have to be done to reduce costs. We have to have a more efficient delivery system, and we have to decrease the burden of disease. For example, we can no longer figure out that every physician, every hospital is an independent island and there's no collaboration. We have to have an integrated healthcare delivery system. And interestingly, that's starting to happen. And it's starting to happen from the financial pressures that are being brought to bear on both the physician and the hospital. As reimbursement gets cut, they figured we've got to consolidate. We have to have the efficiencies of using the back office and all these things, much like mom and pop grocery stores did, much like bookstores did, much like every industry that you can think of across the country consolidated to drive efficiencies. And so we need to have that sort of efficiency in the delivery system. The second thing that we need to do is we need to drive the epidemics of chronic disease out. And one of the things that's driving that, just for example, is the epidemic of obesity. Obesity right now accounts for 10% of the healthcare costs in the United States. And it's going to 20% if it continues at the current rate in the next 10 years. We will never control the cost of healthcare in the United States without controlling that epidemic. And so healthcare reform missed on those two things, but I think the private sector is starting to take over and doing those by driving efficiencies in the delivery system and beginning to talk openly about what we as employers need to do and keep our employees healthy.
And again, we talked about it at the table, but I want everybody to hear it too, which is the Cleveland Clinic is actually taking some steps to put wellness on the map. We were talking about smoking, for instance. I know just from being involved in some of the big smoking litigation around the country, that some of the anti-smoking efforts have been so successful, some of the public campaigns. Where is the corresponding pro-wellness campaigns?
Well, one of the things that we were concerned about was smoking, and so we said, look, we need to take a step forward and look at smoking. So we did a whole series of steps. The first thing we said, no smoking on our campuses, our garages, any of our facilities, on our lawns, etc. And then we stepped out and supported the ban on smoking in public places in Ohio. We then put on a big smoking cessation campaign in Cuyahoga County with patches and programs, etc. And then we announced that we weren't going to hire smokers anymore. Interestingly, over a 5-year period of time, Cuyahoga County went from one of the highest instances of smoking in the country at 28% to 15%. That's a huge change, and it is below the national average now. So you can make a difference, and I think the private sector is doing that.
I want to stay on the national narrative a little bit, Jerry Sue. Maybe you can take this, which is, what do you think, coming back to the idea of Ohio as a swing state, that voters here, think about the county, what is it that they want to hear? What would they like to see addressed in the course of the campaign?
Well, I think certainly the whole idea of job creation is going to be important because that drives the economy. And how can the states work cooperatively with the federal government? What are the opportunities to create jobs, to allow innovation to happen in companies? And I think that's a big piece of it, is how can you support the businesses of our community? What are those federal regulations, rules, et cetera, that allow the businesses to grow. But David, I also think part of the agenda has to be K through 12. And I think that is a national epidemic in many ways that we have to address. And I think people are going to be listening for these candidates to hear what their views are going to be in terms of education.
This is so critical because in addition to what you're doing at the community college level, K through 12 has now been taken on by 2 administrations with varying degrees of success in that we can't seem to come together around the concept of accountability. In other words, accountability for a public school seems to be an ingrained part of reform, but how we do that seems to be very much in flux, and therefore results are in flux, right?
Well, we have a mayor, Mayor Frank Jackson here, working with the Greater Cleveland Partnership, working with the CEO of the schools, bringing forward an education plan, a transformation plan that is moving forward to the state legislature. And it really is about reform. It's looking at everything from teacher evaluations to teacher assignments, as to how people are hired. Everything is on the table, and it is in partnership with the charter schools, so which is a little bit of a new phenomenon in some areas. So I think those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to take on head on, and Cleveland is doing it.
So how are our young people here? I'll give a shout out to John Carroll University, which you know, with the connection obviously to Tim Russert being well known, and one of the things that I think is a terrific part of his legacy is that we have a fellowship program through John Carroll. And so young people come in and they work for us for a period of time. I don't know what they do at John Carroll, but it's unbelievable because we've had, everyone they've sent to us so far, we have hired permanently. It's
Probably Niehaus is right there.
What's that?
The president of the school sitting right there.
And I'm actually a little concerned about my own job at the moment. So, but I ask, beyond the fantastic success of John Carroll, Steve, address the extent to which the Cleveland, student is coming out and is prepared for the workforce.
Well, I think Cleveland, like many other areas, certainly the state and the country, have a mixed report card in that regard. And the efforts of Mayor Jackson and others in combination, in partnership, are long overdue. This is an area where we will increasingly be less competitive absent solving some significant challenges through some structural reform.
You want to comment on that? Because
yeah,
if you want to be hiring people from this area.
Absolutely correct. And I think Jerry Sue was right on the point. We're very proud of our mayor, of the teachers union, and of all the collaborative effort that has this transformational school plan now down in Columbus, going through our election process to vote it through, et cetera. But let's go up just one level from K-12. Jerry Sue made a comment in her early comments. There's 30 universities in and around our region, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young men and women graduating from these areas. Unfortunately, many of them are leaving Northeastern Ohio to find that entry-level job. So the talent is absolutely here. There's terrific talent coming out of these schools. And those of us that are here and growing these businesses, I think, have a really rich audience to tap into.
So what's driving the economy here now, Toby? And as you look at success, you also look at, all right, how do we continue to innovate to reach this next level? What is the opportunity and the challenge there?
Well, I think there's a major sea change going on here. A couple years ago, I spent a luncheon with the New York Times editorial board. 3 times during that, they asked me if the river was still burning. You know, we've moved past this now, and this is, the fire is out, just saying. And it is a city that is, I think, having a renewed sense of its purpose, its future, and I think it is going to be built around keeping the intellectual capital that is coming out of our universities, keeping them here, providing the jobs for them. Many of the jobs are going to be coming into healthcare. We went out and we hired 400 nurses in one day recently. That's a lot of jobs. We need people. We have great paying jobs, and that's going on across the entire city and the community. I just feel tremendous sense of upward mobility, upward motion in this community that I think is becoming palpable now. And I think you see Clevelanders walking with a renewed sense of vigor and pride in their community.
David, there's a resiliency, I think, that Toby's referring to in terms of the people here, because we used to train a lot of people in welding for the auto industry. We're still training people in welding, but they're for medical devices now. And so I think that resiliency, that you can turn the dial, that people can learn new ways of doing business, I think that's a big part of the success. So people who were working in other industries are now in the medical industry, but they're also still in manufacturing. Manufacturing is not dead in Cleveland or the greater Cleveland area, but we're manufacturing new and different things.
We have a relationship with Tri-C, for example, that they train technicians for us and nurses and come directly to our organization for the last 5 years.
You'll see a renaissance of sorts in manufacturing. Our manufacturing employment is significantly up above national average over the last year and a half or so, and expected to continue with that very positive trend. In fact, the rebirth of manufacturing employment in Ohio is greater than by far greater than the national average, and combine it with Indiana and Michigan, and it's leading the country. So this is a broad-based resurgence. And again, I think it comes back to people and commitments. You have a lot of larger businesses like Chris, but you have thousands of small businesses where they've decided to retain their place of doing business here, and they're employing dozens of people, hundreds of people. But in aggregate, it lifts the law of numbers lifts the full boat.
How aggrieved do small business people that you deal with feel right now? I spoke to a group in Washington last week that I think it's fair to say was so frustrated with Washington and with this administration. What's driving that? And again, what message will they send when these candidates come through here?
I think the general attitude, and we operate in 6 states, but you especially see it here where there's momentum, that we could go much further and much faster with direction, with policy, understanding tax rules, regulatory efforts, not just in our sector of banking or financial services, but across the board are more active than they've ever been. And that has some restraining elements to it. So on multiple fronts, the cost of health care, it's hard for business owners, smaller business owners in particular, who when they make capital commitments are making them that will impact their net worth, maybe their lifestyle or their next generation, to be dynamic in this environment. We could go much further, much faster than we currently are because of this series of clouds restraining growth.
And we were talking about that a little bit, Steve, before lunch started today, just about that regulatory environment, whether it's Dodd-Frank in Steve's line of work, or Sarbanes-Oxley, or all the overreaching aspects of this, you know, oftentimes made by politicians who aren't in the space, don't know the parameters, and as ways to try to help, but end up being really debilitating to big companies, small companies, medical institutions, et cetera. So part of that messaging ought to be, you know, less of that, less regulatory overreach, and allow these companies to operate and do what they do best.
Do you think the federal government made a mistake in the way that it intervened in a lot of the economy of the Midwest with auto bailouts? And by that I mean, did they perhaps prevent an evolutionary process that would have been painful for a period of time, but could have really helped the economy of the region evolve?
No, I don't think that was a mistake. I mean, you look at the results now. We have a healthy GM. You know, Ford never took the support and is doing terrific.
Well, you give the president credit for that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You said Cleveland. I'm saying he helped Detroit a lot.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, but there's a residual effect, isn't there, in the northeastern part of the state?
Yeah. You know, the point is that there's just such a basket of things that these elected officials have to do, you know, and they're never going to get it all right. But from time to time, there are policies in all administrations. I mean, I'm not particularly a fan of one side of these guys or the other. Dave, you know, Sherwin-Williams has survived 28 United States presidents by the skin of our teeth here. We'll get through the next one too, whoever he or she is.
I would just like to say something in terms of the auto industry, because we at Cuyahoga Community College worked directly with the Ford plant that closed in 2000. And because of some of the stimulus dollars, we're able to regroup and come forward with a new production line with their 6-cylinder EcoBoost engines. And we were able to retrain about 850 people that really caused the plant to continue to function. So I do think it made a difference in holding jobs and helping people to regroup and retrain.
And, you know, just to piggyback on, you know, the reaching in, I thought TARP was, you know, eventually, I mean, history tells us whether these programs were right or wrong. We look back on that and we have to say that it did a lot of good to save a lot of institutions that wouldn't have made it. These banks are back on their feet. They've paid TARP back. The federal government has benefited as that interest has come their way. I mean, that's the way venture capital thinks. So occasionally they get things right. We give credit where credit's due.
We talked about the boom times of Cleveland in years past, going back to, you know, big oil and big development. What about energy infrastructure and all of the potential for that in this part of the Midwest?
It's massive, and I think we're already starting to see some of those benefits more in Akron, Canton, Mahoning Valley, Youngstown, Warren area than in others. But as a legacy, Cleveland was the oil capital of the U.S. and therefore the world at the turn of the century, 1900s. And there's going to be significant employment expansion. It's estimated to be somewhere between 65 and 75,000 jobs alone in the energy sector as that matures.
Natural gas?
Natural gas and liquids off natural gas, but then there are derivative impacts, just as there are, as we saw in the great work that the clinic does in terms of other businesses. And so you'll find chemical firms setting up and a variety of polymers. And there's a center of expertise globally in polymers here in Northeast Ohio. So it's very optimistic about what the secondary, tertiary opportunities will be coming off this natural gas play.
Yeah, we're building a new building that's devoted primarily to energy training, because again, we're acutely aware that we have to change what we're doing based on what's happening. And even though the shale is really coming through Canton and other parts, we will train people who will move there. We will train people who will relocate for those jobs.
Do you have a view? I was honored to give a commencement address last week in Boston, and I'm a strong proponent of liberal arts education that I came from. I think that post-secondary education is about learning how to think and think critically and problem solve no matter what you do. At the same time, as you look at the challenge of both equipping workers here in the city and the area to not just be the best they can be, but also to stay, do you have, or have you developed a view about what that core education needs to be? Does it need to be more vocational? Does more vocational training have to be the core of what you do?
No, it's both. It's all. We have to train people through the humanities and liberal arts in the same way we train them in the technology and engineering and so forth. So it's both. It's the total person. We're training and educating people to be good citizens, to be able to participate in the democratic process here, to be good voters, to distinguish among candidates. But at the same time, we're training them with specific core competencies for jobs. So it's both.
You know, I have a question that just occurred to me, and hearing such interesting points of view and so much investment. You know, one of the things as a reporter covering the political process, I've seen it at the big national level. I've seen it at the White House level, but I've also seen it covering caucuses in Iowa, which I find so inspiring. And one of the things I find inspiring about covering the caucuses in Iowa is that you can go to I grew up in Los Angeles, so I'd never been to a pizza farm before. So that was eye-opening. But people would come in and families would come in and they would really engage this process. What do you all think is the lesson that Ohio, or how does Ohio model for the rest of the country sort of political discourse and engagement in a way that you think can be inspiring? Anybody have a view on that?
You see a lot of partnering, a lot of efforts to collaborate across the board. And that extends now beyond just Northeast Ohio. Toby's organization collaborates with hospitals around the state, frankly around the world. And so on multiple levels there are opportunities to more effectively leverage the assets that are here as a state, as a geographic region, and I think that's starting to happen.
You know, I would add that I think one of the great things about American democracy is, you know, eventually we get the tough issues out on the table and talk about. And it's things like this, gatherings like this, where you can talk about the really tough stuff that has got to happen. And it's going to be decided not by Washington or capitals, it's going to be decided at the grassroots, where people actually get down and have to live with their decisions on a daily basis. And we cannot begin to address things if we can't talk about them. We have to talk about the really tough issues, and that's what I hope comes out of this campaign.
Well, let's stay with that.
And healthcare, by the way,
yeah.
we never really talked about it in a very logical, unemotional aspect before all this legislation happened. It got tremendously emotional and,
right.
and not thoughtful.
And polarized.
Very polarized.
Which is a big part of it. Well, let's go down the line then, and Toby, you stick with this. What is the tough issue that you're confronting right now as an institution that you've got to work through?
I think well, let me take it in the healthcare industry rather than just mine. I think the tough thing that we have to do is we have to drive that efficiency that I talked about. And now we need to understand how we collaborate, that we don't have an arms race around technologies, and we begin to get the efficiencies. And then the second thing we have to talk about is the really tough problems of the things that cause chronic disease in the United States, and 80%. Smoking, lack of exercise, and eating, which is causing obesity, and all the problems that go with it. And you know, we weren't talking about that 4 years ago.
Yeah, and of course, what that involves is telling some people something that they don't want to hear. They don't want to hear.
Right.
Sacrificing something, which is what they don't like to talk about in Washington.
Let's go back. We couldn't talk about HIV until Magic Johnson came out and said, I got it. And then it was okay to talk about it, and we made major progress at that point. And you know, until we get the tough stuff out and we're willing to talk about it on a non-emotional basis, we're not going to make progress.
Just take a few seconds, each of you, about the tough issue right now.
Specifically at Sherwin-Williams, I guess, you know, we predominantly paint houses, and our country's gone through a recession led mostly by the housing market. So there's been a whole host of mortgage issues related and foreclosures. There's infrastructure spending to keep bridges and highways from collapsing and falling down, paint keeps steel from rusting, et cetera. So we're seeing an aging country. We're seeing these cities struggling to come up with the resources to maintain the existing structures. And so, you know, part and parcel is just to kind of see the underlying asset base of the country be better taken care of and supported. That takes money. That's the conundrum a lot of these communities are in.
And that's certainly a role for government, because government's got to make that outlay.
They belong there.
Yeah.
I think we're faced with this massive fiscal cliff in January, and I'm very concerned in a polarized legislature how that's going to be dealt with. I think that could have serious impacts on the country, and certainly for all of us here in Northeast Ohio. And the initial positioning does not lead to one to be particularly optimistic that it's going to be resolved in advance. And we saw from the last round of this the terrible impact of the debt extension. So that has a lot of impact on our business. The closer we get to that, the more deferred investment will occur. The slower hiring, rehiring will occur. You can almost anticipate a slowdown, much like we saw in the summer of last year around the debt.
Jerry, wind us down here, and then we'll get to some of your questions.
Well, David, I'd really end where I started by saying colleges and universities are a big part of reclaiming the American dream and creating those pathways to possibilities. But for us, it really comes down to 3 challenges: access to education, completion and success, and the cost of education, and how do we keep that cost low. Those are really the 3.
All right. Thank you all very much. We'll continue the discussion with all of you. I think we have roaming microphones, and we'll start with this gentleman right over here.
Mr. Gregory, Stuart Musinski from Project Love Purple America. We heard a lot in your discussion with the business leaders and with our education leader about collaboration and cooperation in Ohio. But the fact of the matter is that even in Ohio, at the neighbor-to-neighbor and at the school-to-school level, collaboration and cooperation is less than it was 10 years ago. As you mentioned yesterday on Meet the Press, Mayor Cory Booker said that negative campaigning turns his stomach. If this kind of behavior were established in a high school or a middle school, we would be calling it bullying. Mr. Gregory, in terms of the example and the fallout from negative campaigning, can we say that President Obama and Mr. Romney and their handlers and consultants are reinforcing or even stoking a bullying culture in the United States? And, you know, everybody on the panel said that the candidates are interested in K through 12, but how do we expect our children to act any differently than our highest officials are?
Well, look, this is the role for citizens, okay? You know, the direct correlation with bullying, I think, is not exactly. I think there are bullying issues, I could say, with having young kids, where there's physical harm and intimidation, and I don't know that I agree with the analogy. But look, negative campaigning works. That's why they do it. If it didn't work, they wouldn't do it. If it was all about positive ads about how they'll change the education system, they'd do that. The reality is that in a lot of cases, you know, contrast ads in elections tend to work. They tend to work particular voting groups. I mean, in your state, you're going to have every subgroup from you know, race and ethnicity to by income, working class to white collar, to women, to men, to college-educated 100,000 plus earners, to 50,000 K earners. I mean, everybody's going to be subdivided by these campaigns, and then the ground game will work, and that's how they, you know, the turnout model. So, you know, ultimately, you know, the Cory Bookers out there as leaders, when they say, you know what, this stuff is just nauseating on both sides. Now, he also had to do a video within hours of being on Meet the Press to walk back what he said, because the campaign was upset with him. So I don't know what the answer is to negative campaigning, except for the ultimate answer, which is that citizens have to not respond so positively to it in making their choices. Look, we have more news and information now than we have ever had in this country. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? You don't have to raise your hand. But you know what? It's both a good thing and a bad thing. I love the access I have to information. But you know what? There's a lot of access I have to junk. Or there's access I have to mere points of view. And what concerns me is that people consume news and information today based on their own predisposition. So if I have a mindset or a particular point of view, I can go have that point of view not only validated, but strengthened by going to my favorite television or radio host or blog or other kind of internet site, and then I've got new ammunition. What I hope Meet the Press is a place where people are coming to say, no, I don't know a lot about this. Let me hear both sides. Let me see if I can make a judgment about it or get some insight about this. We all have a responsibility to do that. We've got to be more informed consumers so that we are not as influenced as a people by advertising that tells us that private equity is bad or that somehow the president's bad because of a pastor that he had for 20 years. We are the ultimate, as citizens, are the ones who sort of move the needle on that, particularly in this media environment.
Yeah, that is so well said. I think the great frustration for Americans is that our elected officials can't do that. They can't come across the aisle and see value in the other person's opinion or point of view. The great statesmen that ran this country in the past don't seem to be.
But to be fair, the political system does not reward that today.
I get it.
They don't reward it. So you can have your favorite leader, who you think is an example of that, who cannot survive. And it's a striking thing today. Now, something's got to break that. We've been through this cycle before.
I think it's also why we don't see a lot of good people. We wonder about why aren't they running for office.
Yeah.
They just don't want to get into the fray.
Right. But I agree with I do agree with the questioner in this respect, which I think that it's very important. I'll tell you kind of a Washington joke. So my kids happen to go to Sidwell Friends, where the president's girls go, and so my son now, who's almost 10, although I don't acknowledge that he's almost 10 until the day, because he's a little old sounding to me. But he said, Daddy, a lot of people at my school are really like President Obama. And I said, oh, what a shock. And they said, yeah, and somebody was really critical of President Bush and this, that, and the other. And I said, well, I don't like that kind of talk. I said, in our family, we respect the presidency, and we're respectful to both sides. He said, yeah, I told the kid that I like Barack Obama and I like George Bush. I just like to know all the presidents. Not only in Washington, right? But there was something positive about that, which is the idea that, good discourse. Anyway, let's keep it moving. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Yes, sir.
Mr. Gregory, in your opening remarks, you talked about the polarization in Washington. About a year ago, we had the Bowles-Simpson Commission report. Why can't we have the independents, the moderate Republicans, and the moderate Democrats coming together and saying there was a viable solution to our problem? Each side had to give something and get that passed. And at the same time, ask your four distinguished panelists, who are recognized leaders in their respective fields, what advice would they give to their party leaders as to how we go about and solve this problem of polarization, and have the country come back together?
Well, so the question is about polarization and about, Simpson Bowles is so popular as a title. I think they should, Kim Kardashian should do it as a reality show. The bottom line answer to why Simpson Bowles didn't pass is because there is no agreement about taxes. Republicans will not vote to increase taxes. Just not going to happen. And now there's other aspects too, where Democrats don't want to deal with some of the entitlement areas that have to be dealt with as well, like Medicare and Social Security. But the fundamental point, the reason why there's no tax reform, still comes down to tax rates, to marginal tax rates. Democrats are not on board with just eliminating loopholes in order to raise more revenue. This is a fight about taxes. I asked Vice President Biden on the program a couple of weeks ago, beyond just same-sex marriage, which certainly had some impact, was, if the president's reelected, do you go into the slam dunk session and say, that's it, no negotiation on taxes, marginal rates are going up for wealthy Americans? And he said, yes. So they expect that the election will solve this. We'll see. But the bottom line is that nobody wants to deal with tax rates, which I think is the fundamental reason why Simpson Bowles didn't work. I also think the president decided, now they will tell you because Republicans were going to oppose it, I think the president, frankly, didn't want to take on the entitlement issue and the debt issue in a way that was going to require pain. Because here's the dirty little secret. To solve this problem is going to hurt. And politicians don't like to tell you that it's going to hurt. So they don't campaign that way. So they keep putting it off. So the other part of the question is, do any of you from your areas of discipline have any particular advice on how polarization in the country can be mitigated? Moving on. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I mean, to your point earlier, until citizens rise up and do something about this and send officials to every level of government that will act as men and women of good conscience and not because they're being driven by a far right or far leftist agenda, that's the only way we're ever going to solve this. We control that. We go to the polls, we vote, we put these people in. We have to hold them accountable for this. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that the first two questions, and I would imagine many more in the room, are on this very topic. This polarization just doesn't work. You can't run a company that way. You can't run a hospital that way. You can't run a school. You have to have thoughts are on the table that are differing so that all cultures and ideas are represented, and that's how you get the best institutions to emerge. Right now, our country's broken in that regard.
I think increasingly you're hearing from business executives and business owners that with controlled spending, there's an appetite for increased taxes to reduce the cumulative deficit and to reduce the future generation's burden. And I believe that message will come through, and I'm optimistic post-election we actually will get meaningful tax reform as part of a broader package.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I actually tend to agree with that.
But there's a big if there, though.
Right.
Well,
And they're willing to do that if
there's
some discipline on the other side.
Yep.
Rob Falls Communications. Ohio through the years has been very good for America. And we've been a donor state for a long time. I wondered if now is the time to ask for the federal government to reinvest in Ohio in a significant way. If we want that money back here, how would the panel ask that money to be spent or invested in Northeast Ohio?
Can you understand that?
I couldn't hear
If
the
I understand it, in what ways could the federal government and should the federal government be investing in this part of Ohio? Is that right? The acoustics are just tough. That's correct?
Well, obviously, I would say, and for me, particularly as coming from the educational arena, I think that I would love to see more investment in adult education and literacy. I think we have a broad sweeping number of people nationally who are reading at the 9th grade level or below. And how are we going to help the adults become part of this new evolving economic drive if they can't read, if they can't compute? So I guess part of it for me would be asking the federal government to, in some ways, give more attention to the adult worker, the person who's been laid off, or the person who is coming into the job market. Sometimes many housewives returning to the job market that haven't been in it, that need to be trained for a new industry. And so adult education, you know, we talk about K through 12 a lot, but as far as adult and adult literacy, that often gets ignored.
One of the things that we recognize in healthcare is 50% of our national obligation is resulting from Medicare. And there's a lot of initiatives to try and cut healthcare spending. One of the things that concerns me greatly is a current initiative to cut for graduate medical education. Essentially, I think that if we do that, we're cutting off our nose to spite our faces, because we are going to need doctors in the future. There's going to be about a 90,000 doctor shortage across this country. We have to be able to train them, and the academic medical centers is where they're going to be trained. And so I think we need to be cognizant in our industry that we have got to reduce costs, but we have to be prudent about where we do it and not sacrifice our future as we do that.
We've had a lot of discussion today about just the phenomenal momentum we're feeling in northeastern Ohio, the $7 billion worth of construction projects, a lot of that private, some of it government, but the momentum here is palpable, and I think keeping that going, David, is critical. We have a number of infrastructure opportunities. We're trying to connect these various parts of our city down to our lakefront, to our central parks areas. We'd like to be able to connect our downtown out to University Circle in a better environment, to our opportunity corridor. We're trying to get a bridge built just on the south side of downtown so that we can drive to work in downtown Cleveland every day. So the government can help do that, and those infrastructure projects sometimes, which in and of themselves may not look that terrific, do a great job of connecting this entire region and keeping this momentum going.
It's a smart point, and I think there's an aspect of the short-term legacy of the stimulus bill that there is not the political will to invest in some of these infrastructure projects around the country that could be so beneficial and could be such job creators, because again, it goes back to the political climate right now, and so such little trust about ultimately not only jobs that would put workers to work, but also what are the plugging that into the larger evolutionary question for economies around the country. Where else? Sir.
Mr. Gregory, I'm Mark Giuliano. I'm the pastor of the Old Stone Church on Public Square. Welcome to Cleveland.
Thank you.
I'm curious, given that Governor Romney will be bringing kind of a new faith perspective into the conversation, and the critiques of President Obama's relationship with Reverend Jeremiah Wright, I'm curious, coming to Ohio, what your thinking is in terms of how faith and religion will become part of the conversation.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think in Governor Romney's case, it's actually striking. The New York Times pointed this out yesterday in a front page piece. I think this is very much the core to who he is. I think that based on, I'm Jewish, my understanding of Mormonism, as I've studied it some, is that the level of commitment, particularly in missionary work, is so deep. And the level of connection between you and your neighbors in your communities that is not, that is inclusive, it's quite inclusive. And the fact that he served as a bishop in the church, which is effectively, as you know, is lay-led and is the equivalent of a priest, says to me, and I think should say to voters, that indeed the faith commitment he's made in his life is very deep, and it's a huge part of who he is. And yet he appears to be uncomfortable speaking publicly about that. And I think it's a shame, because I think that for public figures, understanding the extent to which they're motivated by their faith is very powerful. I remember asking President Bush about this in Jerusalem. And I said, you know, there's a lot of people who viewed your faith as a problem. The idea that you derived a certain certitude about America's place in the world and your place as president because of your faith. And he wanted to put that issue to rest and said, not at all. He said, for me, my faith is about finding a port in the storm. It's about interdirectedness. It's about forging a relationship with God. It's a sense of comfort. It's a sense of perspective. It fosters a sense of humility, not arrogance. I don't know that we're going to have that conversation, I hate to say, because I think it makes people uncomfortable. And it appears to make Governor Romney uncomfortable. I can tell you, speaking to some of his political advisors, one of their concerns about winning Ohio is the concern about being a Mormon in the state and whether that will hurt him in certain parts of the state. So they're acutely aware of the political impact, particularly as he courts social conservatives. I think the issue with President Obama's faith, I think President Obama still suffers a bit from this perception of him being aloof and private and not very accessible to people. So I think they both have a bit of that as they campaign. And you know, associations with Reverend Wright, I just think that that's run its course. I think that Governor Romney doesn't want any part of that discussion. I don't think Republicans want any part of that discussion. And apart from it, just on the face of it, there's another aspect. Americans like President Obama. Many Americans, I mean, there are hardcore conservatives who don't like him, Republicans, et cetera, but a lot of Americans want him to succeed. And not just because they want America to succeed, but Americans felt very good about themselves in 2008, electing the first African-American president. And I know, again, this is from polling data, it's also talking to political professionals. There are voters, even if they don't love the president, who are concerned about shutting this story down. You know, this idea that the evolution of America, getting to a place of electing the first African-American president, is this how it ends? That he has a kind of Jimmy Carter fate, that he's a one-term Democratic president? I can tell you that there is a belief in the professional circles that for a number of voters, that will be something they'll really struggle with as they get closer to election time, and perhaps even in this state. So, anyway, long-winded answer to your question.
David, just to add to that very
Yes.
quickly, I think, though, the elections recently have caused us to deal with some very tough value issues, whether it's religion, gay rights, etc. It's really put it on the table, and I think Toby talked about that a minute ago, that somehow, I think, in having to embrace these issues and decide how we think about them is good for us. And I think the whole idea of the discussion of religion, broad religions, has been good for us.
Yeah, very, although I don't know what will be harder, talking about religion or solving the debt crisis.
Yeah.
So we maybe take one at a time. We just got a few minutes left, so we'll try to be a bit shorter in our answers, and we'll try to get a couple more in. Yes, ma'am.
In the last election, a very important voting demographic were the under 30-year-olds, or perhaps even more specifically under 25-year-olds. We know that recent college graduates were disappointed in the limitation on career opportunities. So Dr. Thornton, with respect to your students, what is your sense about their interest, their engagement, and their commitment to vote in the upcoming election?
Well, our average age is 29. Thank you for the question. Our average age is 29. So we are not a college of recent high school graduates only. We are a college of recent high school graduates, but also a lot of adults who are coming back. And it gives the discussion a richness and a fullness because it's across age groups, it's across racial groups, it's across religious groups. We really are a melting pot, and so there's high interest. There's high interest in voting registration and looking at how the voting rights may change. And so I would say we have a heightened, on all 4 of our campus, a heightened interest in the campaign and a heightened interest in participation.
You want me to take it from there? Okay. I guess the place to end then, as we have a couple of minutes, is to ask each of you what you hope is the new thing for Cleveland. You want to take that first?
Yeah, well, I hope the new thing, in many respects, is the old thing about Cleveland. That's the remarkable resilience, to quote Jerry Sue earlier on, of our people here. This is a proud corner of the United States. We have picked ourselves up by our own bootstraps over and over and over again. We've been helped along the way occasionally by governments, but most times not. And the resources to get that done, and the drive and the commitment and the innovation are right here in this room today. And all you have to do is you walk out the front door of the Renaissance on your way back to your offices and just take a look around the skyline of this great city and all that's happening here. And it's a really exciting time to be living in Cleveland, Ohio.
Toby addressed one thing I wanted to bring up before, is what we were talking about at the table, is the medical mart, the plan for that, the vision for that. What's it going to mean?
Well, I see a need for this as I traveled around the world trying to see how you put things into a hospital. Third of the cost of a hospital is the equipment that goes in it, and there's no place to go see it all in one place. And I think we have an opportunity here. And as we begin to talk to major companies, they're envisioning a whole new kind of a mart where IBM and General Electric and many of the other companies come in and say, how can we envision the operating room for the future? How can we look out by combining our efforts here? And this becomes a very exciting new opportunity for visioning something that has never been done anyplace else. And you know, this is our opportunity to plow new ground for this community and really take off on the great medical expertise that exists here.
Cleveland defines Ohio. And the sense of pride and the realization of significant efforts over many years, I think has much broader impacts, but certainly is very, very powerful in redefining Ohio and the Midwest in terms of this recovery that we're enjoying. And I would hope we would become more self-confident and expressive of the comeback, the resurgence, and the pride that's been well-earned in the success and future of Cleveland. It's very exciting.
I would hope that the Renaissance can continue. We feel it, we see it, and that the federal government and public policy would be a catalyst for that Renaissance, helping to thrust us forward rather than holding us back.
Thank you all. I mean, I think I speak for everybody who learned about this area that Cleveland rocks.
Yeah.
Right? Thank you.
Well, you've been listening to the City Club Business Leader Series, and I want to thank David Gregory and our panelists again for just a tremendous panel today. We have a special gift for David for coming to visit us today. I know it's 85 degrees out here, but...
Thank you. Oh, that's awesome. Wow.
From the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you started your day here this morning.
Oh my gosh.
At the Rock Hall, and you're...
Fantastic. That is cool. I will wear that. Trust me. I love gear. I'll wear that.
You nailed it with Cleveland Rocks. Well done. So that concludes today's panel. Thank you very much.